Recording on now. Take it away, Josh.
All right, so first up on the agenda, we have the action items from previous weeks. So as always, please take a look at that and see if there's anything that you need to follow up on or anything you already have followed up on and just need to check off. Take a look at that after the meeting. Let's go on through the next items. There are two pending proposals. 86 was pending last week, and we agreed that we wanted a summary of that one.
Before we get to that, let me just remind everyone about this, maybe. I just wanted to...
Right, yes. So tomorrow is our monthly planning meeting for the design meetings. So if there are any items that you want to have a planning meeting over this month, then please make sure there's already a meeting proposal filed. There are a couple already available. Alex Crichton has one regarding WebAssembly calling conventions, for example, and we should discuss those tomorrow. And then after that, we should, if we have time after planning the month's meetings, we should go through statuses for any open projects to see if there are any that we haven't heard from in a while or any that need an update in terms of moving forward.
So I will say I've been putting off for a while, or just not getting around to, is maybe more accurate, updating our list of projects, but I really, really want to do that today. So when I do that, I will also ping people to try to get them to post updates on the tracking issues and so on.
Sounds good. Then so going on to the pending projects, 86 allow the compiler to eagerly drop values. We agreed on a previous week that we didn't want to go forward with this, but that we would still like a summary as a Lang team design note to explain why this is complicated, because there was a fair bit of analysis on Zulip that we'd love to have captured, but I don't believe this needs any further action from us today. Do we want to go ahead and close this issue and just request the summary, or do we want to leave it open until that summary happens?
I think
My
you should close
inclination would
it.
be to go ahead and close it.
Yeah, maybe someone could take an action item, maybe me, to try to, like, I just want to make sure we have an action item for writing the summary and track it that way. We may already have it. Not necessarily writing the summary, but making sure the summary happens. I know I had an action item to reach out about it. Mark, if you want to record Nico to make sure it happens,
I can do that.
I'd be up for that.
Sounds good, though I would say, Nico, you may want to bound the total number of action items you take today that may take non-trivial amounts of time, given that you wanted to try to prepare the information for tomorrow's meeting as well.
Yeah, you're not wrong. I may hand it off to someone at post meeting.
So next up, we have proposal 89, change path attribute behavior of modules. This is new this week from 4 days ago. This has come up a few times, but it's the first time it's turned into a proposal. And the proposal is to change how paths resolve when you're inside a module that was declared itself using a path attribute to say, get it from this file. This would necessarily have to be an addition change for compatibility reasons. We should try to figure out if we want to make a change in this area and if this sounds vaguely plausible. It's getting down to the wire for addition changes, so we may also, and this may or may not be something that is critically important to get in because we've lived with it for 3 years. So we should decide if this is something we want to try to push in through the agenda, as well as if this is something we want at all in its general form.
I would argue it's too late for 2021.
I would tend to agree. We originally said by April 1st, I believe.
Yeah, the group hasn't, like, just for various reasons, like we didn't look into the holiday schedule when we made those deadlines and so on. We haven't written up the blog post and everything, but I think we're basically done.
And the prioritization section in the MCP itself says not very urgent. So it would be hard to say, no, we really ought to push on it.
However,
It's also worth noting
I
there's
think
a
we
few
could still
different
consider it.
options we have here that we might also potentially be able to reduce the impact of path overall rather than changing path relative items. So we should discuss this in more detail, I think, rather than trying to rush it by the deadline, given that we've kind of already passed the deadline. To be clear, I should say I'm not suggesting there's a bunch of open questions so much as I think there's some worthwhile discussion to make sure this is what we want.
The general idea of it to match the foo.rs versus foo/lib.rs distinction seems pretty reasonable to me.
It is it does seem reasonable as well. I think the question is, do we unify around something that always acts like you do modules in the way that we assume you should do modules? Or do we always match what the actual file is? Or there's a third option if we're doing an addition boundary of saying, if you're going to write path, then you have to make your module follow one or the other module pattern, like you must use or you must not use mod.rs. So
Yeah.
there are several options
So-
here, and we should discuss which one we want.
I'm finding it hard to take notes because I haven't read the issue and I have no idea what you all are talking about. I don't really
Sorry.
understand. I don't know if we
So
want to try to explain it or just move on and come back, but
Well, there's a quick summary, which is when you're using the path attribute on a module to specify that rather than loading it from the expected location, you want to load it from a specific file. That currently affects the module path for how you would resolve the name of that object. And it's affected by whether the containing module is a mod.rs or a named file. So there are some inconsistencies there, and this proposal is trying to reduce those inconsistencies and make it easier to work with path and get results that are more likely to be what you would expect.
is this accurate? This sounds right? So is it making it more file-like?
I think we should probably dig
Yeah.
into the details on this one if and when we end up doing a design meeting on it.
Yeah, I agree. We shouldn't go into it now.
So I think that tomorrow's planning meeting, we may want to decide if this is something that should have a design meeting. But I think in this meeting, it might be worthwhile to get a consensus on, does anybody want to push for this happening in the 2021 edition? Or is everybody happy with the idea of this happening at some indefinite future time?
I think I'm perfectly happy to not have it in 2021. I do think that we run the risk of getting into a pattern where if we don't accept something to a current edition, it gets delayed to the next edition, and then we don't consider it until relatively late in the cycle for the edition in the first place. So it might be better to try to, even for things like this, when we say we're delaying it, to still try to consider them very early in the edition development cycle.
So complete agreement, and I'm suggesting we do actually consider this with a design meeting. I'm just suggesting let's schedule that meeting tomorrow for sometime this month, have the discussion, and not feel like we have to rush it by the 2021 edition. It may well happen in 2021 or 2022, and then we just defer the actual change until the edition, or
Awesome.
have an opt-in mechanism.
Okay, just wanted to double check about that. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. Especially
I
with
don't
the
want to
last
follow in
part
that pattern either.
about opt-in.
So
Right.
that aside, though, any further thoughts on this item before we move on?
Nope, I'll just record meeting consensus is do not target Rust 2021, but do continue discussing for a future edition.
And I agree with
Okay.
Felix that we should probably have the 2024 as unstable in the compiler relatively soon,
Yeah, we can talk about that, but I
Agreed.
agree.
but that's a future meeting question.
All right.
So next up, we have RFC 2845. We've talked about this RFC before. It's about super trait item shadowing to avoid the issue of being unable to define a subtrait that inherits from a super trait where both define the same method and deal with it unambiguously. There was a bunch of discussion about the behavior we want. The last activity on it was that I'd posted a comment back about a month ago exactly, suggesting that we could treat this as ambiguous for a forward compatible solution for now. Scott, you nominated this 5 days ago. Do you want to summarize what you were hoping to get from the nomination?
I just stumbled on it again for some reason and noticed that it was in one checkbox away from FCP and wondered if we wanted to say and wanted to poke at it and say, hey, do we have a concern here? If I were to check Boats's box, then it would immediately go into FCP, which is probably not exactly what I wanted to do because I looked like Nico had some things that you were still pondering about it.
I did. Well, I'm trying to bring it back into cache. So I had a comment.
How about I just say that we can put a note for Felix and Nico to
Yeah,
concern it or checkbox it, and then we move on for this meeting.
Action items,
approve.
sure.
I'll unnominate.
Do we have an action
That
item scribe,
sounds-
by the way?
Yeah, I'm taking
yeah.
that.
Thanks, Mark. Okay.
That sounds accurate. I would follow up as well that I don't actually recall in the comment that I posted a month ago treating such method calls as ambiguous. There's a bunch of context here. I believe that was referring to Nico's comment
Oh,
regarding
just take it
what
out.
happens when you call the shadowed method from inside the definition of the subtrait. And so the proposal is that from outside, you still get the subtrait. From inside, you get an ambiguity error still, just like you do today. And so I think that needs an update to the RFC to implement the proposal that Nico and I seem to be in favor of. So in addition to filing a concern, I think that, good, Nico, you just filed a concern.
I
So
did.
yeah, I think there is actually a change to the RFC needed here to define when it should give an ambiguity error.
Yeah. I'll have to reread to remember, but I probably agree with myself from however long ago.
Okay, next up we have add const UB RFC. This is 3016. We have discussed this one really extensively in meetings. The previous discussion was the one that discussed along the lines of we don't want to mandate UB detection. We just want to state that we're doing UB detection. Ralph rewrote the RFC based on an earlier draft that did exactly that. So I don't think we should sit in this meeting and read the RFC, but I do believe that we have now gotten what we asked for. So I think that we need to take action items to read the RFC and go forward with it if it meets our expectations. This was, I believe it's still technically in FCP with a blocking issue.
We should cancel that and restart it if it's been rewritten.
Yes, that seems like a good plan.
I'll just do that now.
So we should cancel the FCP and then propose FCP as soon as we have a chance to read it. Either that or go ahead and propose FCP on the assumption we want this and then have people check off their boxes when they have read this.
I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to propose FCP right now because I think we do, but people should check their boxes when they feel ready, assuming they do.
I think we had a
Can
good
you summarize that in
conversation.
your FCP proposal as well to state that we will be rereading the rewritten version? And then I think we can move on from this one unless anybody has anything about this that needs a live discussion rather than an asynchronous review.
No, I think we had a good conversation about this that other time. I'll take on these next two since I think I've nominated both of them. We are in FCP for raw keywords. However, there's also this new RFC about reserving token space without defining semantics for any of that reserved token space. These are both edition changes, so we want one or the other of them, we're pretty sure, for this next edition. The question that I wanted to bring up here is, do we want to say delay the raw keywords one to give more discussion time for it in favor of switching over to FCPing the reserve prefixes one? Or are we happy with where we are on all that? I like the idea of the prefix reservation one. There's been a bunch of comments on the raw keywords about, hey, this isn't great. Do we even want to do this? Boats has a interesting comment there, for example.
I haven't seen all the latest comments.
I
However,
have read through the latest, and I think there's reason enough to pause the FCP on 3098. I do actually still think we should go forward with 3098 rather than delaying it for a long time. I wouldn't favor the don't do it until we need it approach. That there's a part of a proposal is, well, we don't actually have to do this if we reserve the context until we need the keyword. I think if we do that, then the next time we get around to it, we will start to make the same arguments we do about reserving keywords today, which is, well, should we really do this or should we just wait for the edition? I think part of the point of this was to make one decision in isolation, separate from any specific thing that we need, saying this is what it always looks like when we want to use an early keyword. That said, I do think we should delay this a little bit to, among other things, let someone do an implementation PR for Khash and do a crater run, which would allow us to determine if we can just use Khash in every edition. And if we can, then I would be happy to see the RFC just say, let's do Khash in every edition.
Is there another reason?
To give due time for consideration for the comments from Boats and Eric Huss saying, let's not do this at all. I don't know that we necessarily want to stop this one. I personally still think it's a good idea, but we received a comment during the final comment period, and we should give it due consideration before just letting the final comment period end.
Yep. Another thought I have is, so if we do go forward with 3101, I guess another thing we could do with an implementation is to actually write some code using this style, right? Which might help with, because it seems like the major concern raised is this is so ugly no one would ever use it. Is that a good summary?
Yeah.
This is me skimming the thread real fast.
So I'm not sure that so ugly we'd never use it is how I would summarize the concern. I think it's more the concern from Boats was more, would we actually end up using this, or would we end up taking long enough to process the keyword change that we want to do? Sorry, the non-keyword part of any change, that the keyword can just take the next edition and it wouldn't be a long delay. I personally wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I do think there's value in saying we can try this right away on Nightly using a new keyword that uses K-hash, but I think it's worth considering that. And someone else also raised the question, Eric, I think, raised the question, could we instead have a mechanism similar to Feature that lets you opt in, whether you're on Nightly or Stable, to using the new keyword, and then just say, I want the keyword, and use the keyword without the K-hash. And that one, my actual thought is we could, and that's a worthy alternative that's worth considering.
I'm against it for the reasons we've always been against it. With the reason we don't have that mechanism, but we could have that
Say more.
discussion. The reason we chose not to do that is because we don't want to have, we want it to not be complicated to figure out what kind of Rust you're allowed to use, is sort of the short version. And so if you have code bases that opt into like feature A, but not feature B, and feature C, but not feature D, then you get a sort of, what do you call it?
Combinatorial explosion. of
Combinatorial
dialects.
explosion of dialects of Rust. Whereas with the edition system, you have really only like one thing to know. What edition are you in? That determines everything else. That's partially true. The only part that's not true is sometimes people have like, well, I'm stuck on Rust 1.22 or whatever, and it only has certain features. But that's a different orthogonal question. And with this K-hash, you have even less to understand because, you know, no matter which edition you're in, you sort of have access to at least the
Right,
keywords.
it's context free, that makes sense. And then
Right.
if you're in a new edition, you just get to drop the K-hash.
But it's all right. We can have the discussion still. I'm good with your, personally, I agree with you, Josh, that pausing the FCP, but moving forward with 3101 is pretty reasonable.
So concretely, I would propose that we add a concern on 3098 that is pure, that is just let us resolve the reservation RFC 3101 first, and let's also do a crater run first. I guess maybe those should be two concerns.
Felix, do you have something you're about to say?
I don't know. I keep reading. The problem, my problem is only just, it's so stupid. When I first read the summary, I literally thought ident was meant to be a keyword here. Like I didn't realize it was meant to represent the group of all identifiers. And it took me a while of reading the text to eventually realize that mistake. And I was just trying to think of some way to like make it clear in the presentation, but I don't even have a good suggestion. I'm just, maybe I'll post it as a concern, but I don't even know how to phrase it or an alternative option to propose. So I'll just be quiet.
So how about I post, I can at least start with putting a concern on this one of.
I'll write the concern.
It's
my own thing, so I'll write it.
Oh, I meant the general one of pause in favor of 3101 for now.
I would say I think we should have two concerns, one for pause until 3101 and the other for pause until we have the result of a crater run. Well, I should say, I think that one should be up to you, Scott. We could either, on the latter case, pause until we have a crater run, or you could write the RFC to say, if crater run says yes, then do this, else do that. But that's more work writing the RFC. And if it's easier to just write a PR and do a crater run and then write the RFC one way, then either way is fine.
For me, it's much easier to write the RFC than that PR. I don't know if someone who knows more about the tokenizer would say that the PR is easier.
Okay, then either way, I would say you may want to.
I have a question. What does it mean to pause until RFC 30101, first of all? But secondly, if we did do RFC 3101 and there's implementation of it, we can presumably check what that impacts, right? That's a superset of K-hash. And my hunch is like one crater run would tell us whatever answers we need, right?
Possibly, but if the larger crater run says that reserving that syntax in every edition would be a breaking change, that doesn't necessarily mean that k-hash is a breaking change. It may be that somebody else is using a magic prefix for C strings, for example, and that would break.
Agreed. I'm just saying we can look at the results
Agreed.
and extract the data we need, or at least it would be easy based on that implementation to do k-hash. Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, it's fine. But I still don't understand what pause until RFC 3101 means. I think it means, I think this is sort of orthogonal. We're going to pause until we have finished up the discussion about like whether this is a good idea, but we're independently going forward with 3101, right? Which resolves the timing for.
Yeah, I think it's pause. The critical part of will be solved by 3101. So we're going to pause spending effort on this one until 3101 makes progress.
Okay.
It feels like
Is
we
that
should
fair?
cancel the FCP
So
personally.
I think do I think that? I think that it's annoying because I think we should cancel the FCP, but note these things in the OP or something.
Yeah, I mean, I just, it feels
That's
really
fair.
weird to pause a active FCP with a sort of implicit
Open-ended
assumption that
concern. Yeah.
we are, potentially going to change the RFC because the design space is actively changing because of some other RFC. It feels odd to
Yeah.
register that as a concern.
That's a good point, especially since it's actually in FCP. If it was PFCP, then maybe just a concerning it would be fine. But since it's actually made it to FCP, I agree with cancel.
Fair. Given that we're not prioritizing this one for the edition and that we can do it asynchronously as long as 3101 goes in for the edition, then there's not really a concern about the additional 10-day delay. It's not really a problem.
Right.
Okay. Okay. So that discussion also covered 3101. I think one additional item on 3101, though, is that there are a couple of open discussion points for which the RFC needs updating to reserve some additional pieces of token space. Concretely, there was a proposal to additionally reserve.
Can we summarize what the RFC says now? I don't know if everyone's read it. Just real briefly, shouldn't be long.
So the overall RFC is to reserve some space for future language design and prevent that space from being used in macros. Originally, it was proposing to reserve identifier hash any identifier, which would cover the k-hash proposal as well as any future proposal where we needed an extension for how to interpret an identifier, and also reserving double quote space. So identifier double quote string contents double quote, which would allow us to create new things similar to the existing raw strings or byte strings. The notion there is that would reserve enough space for us to implement things like C strings or UTF-16 strings or similar. It's currently being extended to also cover single quotes after identifiers in case we wanted to use that space for something unusual related to characters or similar, and the identifier hash number space as well if we wanted things like alternate base specifications or special number formats. And that I believe actually that RFC has been updated based on the latest requests now that I look at it.
Yeah, looks like 16 hours ago it got a new update with everything.
And the other thing that got updated was there was some debate over whether the reserved space should error out at tokenization time if we haven't defined a meaning for it, or whether it should pass on through and be usable in a macro. To summarize the discussion from Zulip, if we allowed it to be passed through to macros, then you could implement prototypes of new syntax. But on the other hand, you could potentially implement macros that use this space in ways that will conflict with our reservation. And one person proposed on Zulip that if you're going to prototype, you might as well prototype using the actual keyword and not the k-hash keyword, which among other arguments suggests we should just error out at tokenization time so that there can never be a conflict with the reserved syntax that we're proposing, which means we never have to worry about breaking even a macro when we do this. The RFC does effectively propose that we don't worry about breaking anything that conflicts with this reservation, but that's still something where if somebody used it widely, we might still be annoyed.
The Zulip conversation had a bunch of good examples of like, here's a couple of ways where if we don't make this a tokenization failure, it'll still break macro rules and etc. if we try and
Right.
ever use it for something. So it also had some clever ideas of ways that might get around it, but I like just make it a tokenization error. And if we find a clever corner that we'd want to expose later, we can always do that.
There's also that if we make this a tokenization error rather than a passing it through to a macro, then we reserve the ability to have this tokenized differently than just here is one token. We previously said, oh, we're changing this to tokenize from 3 tokens to 1 token. But if we reserve this in tokenization, then we could choose for this to expand to something else as seen by macros. Or for that matter, use one of these prefixes in macro space if we needed to. So if we wanted to add some new keyword in macro syntax or some new piece of macro syntax, this would also be available for that if we make it a tokenization error.
Yeah, so it's basically very forward compatible with all kinds of opportunities.
So this one, I think we are right up to the boundary of the addition. This needs to happen at an addition boundary. And I do agree that this is a more general proposal than the k-hash proposal. Does anybody object to making this FCP merge for the addition, and then people will still be able to raise any concerns during FCP, but does anybody have any concerns now that suggest we shouldn't go forward with this?
I do not.
Sounding like a resounding silence.
I still feel a little bit hesitant about the sort of speed here, but I have no concrete concerns, so yeah.
Okay. If in that case, I would propose we go ahead with FCP. I will take the action item to write the FCP for this one. And if anybody wants to, obviously, please take a close look before checking your box. And if you have any concerns, please raise them as concerns.
The one impact that is potentially interesting is if people are using this in funky ways in macros already, like F strings example that someone mentioned. But I think that's sort of, well, yeah, by design in a way.
Right. I think that the plan here is we would do a PR, we would run that PR through Crater, and based on the outcome of that Crater run, we would choose what editions to do this in. We could do this only in the 2021 edition, or if it turns out nobody has ever used this in a macro or to any significant degree, then we could potentially do this in 2018 or 2015 or both, depending on, well, sorry, rephrasing that, either 2018 or both 2018 and 2015. If it turns out that nobody's used this or nobody's used this in 2018.
I have one question. How much detail does the RFC go into with respect to macros across crates? Like,
Say more.
if we change the tokenizer and you invoke a macro from another crate, I think the answer is you in a 2021 crate, you simply cannot use these syntaxes, even if there's a macro that would accept them from 2018.
Right, because your parsing of the span you're passing to the macro happens in 2021, and
Right.
you will not be able to write that token.
The workarounds there, the only place that I think got brought up where
you
that
can
gets
just put the
impacted
space.
is when if the macro actually cares about there being no space between the tokens.
But how can the macro
Because
even
2018
tell?
would see them as, I think would
Like
have to be a proc
like a
macro.
procedural macro. Yeah, okay. No, this is not a problem. I should take some notes, but I mean, that's pretty narrow. Okay.
Right, no, that's a good point. If a macro was accepting this as 3 tokens, something space hash space something, then you would just need to insert the white space in your crate, and you would now be outside of the reserved space, and the macro will be fine, and you'll be fine.
Yeah. Okay. Then
So that makes it even
not
more
especially
likely
concerned.
that this is not going to break anything. Okay. So I will take that action item, and if there are no other concerns about that, then let's move on to the next item. So we have 82633. This is a p-high issue on Rust Lang Rust. We previously discussed this one, and our consensus, which we confirmed via an RFC bot poll on the issue, was that we do want to prohibit function types that return an out that is not sized, at least until we have any kind of unsized type support in the future. Estebank put in a PR to do exactly that. There is some discussion about whether that PR is sufficient, but it's definitely an improvement. There is some discussion about whether it's still possible to exploit the things that the PR doesn't cover, which specifically includes impl trait. So you can still have a function type that returns an impl trait that is not sized. But that said, the PR is likely an improvement, and I think it's up to compiler folks to review the PR rather than language folks.
Yeah,
but I
yeah.
think that the PR is doing what we asked for. So I believe this is on track to be solved, and we should let it go through the normal compiler review process. Any further thoughts for this? Okay, then in that case, I would suggest that we let that PR go through and close this issue when that happens. And we should also note that people should open a new issue if it turns out there is a way to generate unsoundness using impl trait or projections. Next up, we have a nominated reference PR. Document raw pointer to usize and pointer from usize casts. This was proposed in February and was nominated for consideration in response to Ralph saying that Lang needs to make the call here. There is a lot of discussion about this in Zulip. Long story short, there's a question of whether usizes that were obtained from pointers have the concept of provenance. And if you have been following the discussion, then you would see there's a whole bunch of advantages and disadvantages in both directions. If you haven't been following the discussion and the general concept of provenance isn't something you've seen, then you may want to dig into the proposal and discussion here.
Is there a concise summary of the discussion somewhere that's not like in Zulip?
Not that I'm aware of, and in particular, this reference PR does not appear to summarize any of the advantages and disadvantages because it's just documenting the language change itself. And the proposal in this PR is that casting to usize loses provenance. So if people want to have more depth on that, I don't think there's anything other than Zulip available. Towards the end of the Zulip conversation, there are some general, like, here are the trade-offs posts, but those have not been copied anywhere else.
I guess I'll have to catch up a little, but I'm not clear on why we would pick this specific thing to document. Like, there seems like this is kind of wading into Stack Borrow's territory, and it's not obvious to me why we would start with this change.
I think part of the issue is that right now this is not defined, and the goal is to make this not undefined behavior by specifically saying, here is the definition of the behavior. I don't think this is a borrows issue because this is about raw pointers casting to and from usize.
It absolutely is, but I mean, it's certainly something that Stack Borrows like models when it's UB and when it's not. But I mean, okay, I'll have to dig into like for Stack Borrows, when you go from a reference to a raw pointer, you can then take it to usize and back and whatever else. And I think it doesn't have any effect on what's legal and what's not legal. And that was a design goal. That
Okay.
I'm not exactly sure how that interacts with the language that's in this PR, which is I'm basically wondering if we can say something that's, I just want to understand a little better the motivation for why we would want to say this.
Well, I think one key item here is I don't think we're going to resolve this one in this meeting because this is more than just, do we want to add this to the reference? This is this how we want the language to be defined? And that's a decision we shouldn't make in 5 minutes notice when a bunch of people haven't seen the discussion. So I think we need to take this one asynchronous and get a good summary of what the trade-offs are and what ones we're making by accepting this PR.
Yeah.
It also potentially feels like there is a design meeting or something to have. Like, I'm not sure, at least a sort of maybe naive question might be, is this the right place to start if we want to document that, where provenance is kept and not, in terms of prioritization on like general, it's probably a hard question. Maybe there's more important things.
It might make sense to invite Ralph for a design meeting on this item and effectively say, help us understand the trade-offs between keeping provenance on integers and dropping provenance on integers so that we can make a call.
I think I would go a little bit one step back and say,
right, that's what I was saying.
Let's plan how we want to move forward with like this aspect of the unsafe code rules, and what we need RFCs, just like the overall plan of attack, which topics to cover, and maybe that leads us to this PR, but I'm not convinced it will.
Sure. I don't think that we should, I agree that we shouldn't treat this PR as the motivating item. It's more, Ralph and many others have been in this discussion trying to figure out what the next step is for what we want to do about pointer provenance. And I think the next step is that we need to make a decision about pointer provenance, not that we need to decide whether or not to accept this PR.
Yeah.
Whatever we decide about pointer provenance will then determine how we want to update the reference.
I don't think that's the next step. Like it feels like it's looking at a very concrete tree in a pretty big forest. And I'm not convinced that this is the tree to look at. So like there's a separate discussion, I think, about which trees to look at first.
You mean pointer provenance mark specifically?
I'm saying, like, you know, if we want to define, like, this is at least somewhat adjacent to the memory model, and I'm not sure, like, I don't know enough to say that we should start by defining this piece of the memory
Right,
model
right. I
versus
think
some
that's
other
what
piece. And I think,
So to clarify something, I think that's worth checking with Ralph to find out, is this a small step we should bite off and solve? Or one potential
Right.
position is we should do this as part of a larger effort, and we should check that.
Yep.
If this is something we should do incrementally, then we can figure out what the next step is on it. But yes, I agree that whether and what are both open questions, and we should discuss both of those with, among other people, Ralph.
yeah, for sure.
sounds like
Okay,
we're in agreement.
Can we, I guess maybe we can just discuss tomorrow in terms of design meeting.
Yeah. I don't know that there's an action item from this. I guess somebody can comment to this effect in the.
Yeah, I think the action item would be to say that we want to wait until we've actually made a decision on this, and that we need to defer that decision to a design meeting with which we'd like to coordinate to Ralph about.
I can take that. I also would say,
So-
I'm not especially, just like procedurally, I would kind of want an RFC, not an RFC, and then update the reference.
Or an
So,
MCP for
in
that
some
matter.
in some sense, I might want to close this PR regardless, because I just don't think we're not ready for it yet. But
Given that we can always reopen it later if it matches what decision we make, then yeah,
Right.
no objection to just closing it for now to avoid the tail wagging the dog.
I think I will do that unless someone objects. Or I'll say that I wish to, and we'll see what they say.
Okay, next up, we've got about 10 minutes left, and we've got 6 or 7 items to go through, so we're probably not going to get to all of them. So before we jump into these, is there any particular item that people want to call attention to that they would especially like to look at? I suspect that this revert of a roll-up merge is probably something we want to discuss and prioritize. Are there any others people want to prioritize?
The roll-up merge doesn't seem super important. I would like to ask if there's been any progress on. I'd like addition-related things. I'm not sure if any of these, like, has there been any progress on const generics? I'd probably say const generics is most, and then patterns second. But
Okay. Then, so quick update on const generics. This is definitely getting hot potatoed between the language and library teams. I've been in the lib meetings too, and in both cases, it seems like we're not sure what next steps are. So I've passed on the communication to the library team that from a language perspective, we would like to see feedback from actual users, and that we are not sure that we see the value in dropping this mechanism if we have to keep it eternally for previous editions anyway. Beyond that, I've passed on that we didn't really have any other specific feedback about other than wanting to get that information. So I would propose that we don't need to give this further consideration until after we get that user feedback and find out whether this is a thing we would want to do or not. We absolutely want to use the const generics. I should say the title here is a little misleading. The decision that needs making is, do we want to require const generics for standard Arch intrinsics, or do we want to allow passing a must be constant compile time argument as a positional argument?
can we unnominate it?
I would propose that we do, yes. It still needs ongoing consideration, but it certainly doesn't need to be nominated for either lang or lib. We need the feedback.
I guess one question I might have, do we feel that there is like, would it be a problem if essentially we don't get this feedback and we end up not doing anything, like we don't actually change the behavior, we don't require it in 2021? Because I think, like, if we don't actively assign someone to, I don't know, post on internals, drive that feedback, I don't think it's going to happen in time for 2021.
It's a reasonable point. Would anybody on Lang be sad if we don't make this change and we just always have a special case as a Rust-C attribute that allows you to pass a must-be const argument positionally?
Well, I mean,
aren't we stuck on that on 2018 anyway?
We are. That's the point. The question is, do we keep it for 2021? Would anybody be sad if we do?
I wouldn't be especially sad. I think we have the option of doing it at some future time. It's,
right. That's the main point, is like, if we postpone this by potentially 3 years, is that a problem? If not, then we should definitely unnominate, I think.
yeah.
Agreed. And I think that this isn't going to get any worse. Either way, the compiler has to keep the support forever for compatibility.
Right.
Yeah. Given that we're stuck with it for 2018, I don't think it's something that we need to push really hard on for 21.
Yeah.
So on a different note, I do want to call attention to a procedural point here, which is that I don't recall the language team ever, like, we reviewed these intrinsics in general because they're intrinsics. I don't recall us having any specific discussion or consideration regarding this magic Rust-C attribute. And
It was a known misstep in its stabilization. It was missed as a special thing while stabilizing these intrinsics, because Lang only weighed in on the overall idea of having SIMD intrinsics, from what I know. But
sure,
the
I think
specific
it
ones
also
were not
fell by the
evaluated.
wayside as a side effect of we have a way to implement this using a giant match statement, and that didn't end up getting careful consideration as a result. So yes, I do think that makes sense. I'm glad that that was noted. Is there some procedural step that we may want to convey in terms of this is an item where we do think, because normally a magic Rust-C internal attribute that can't be used outside of the library, it has not typically been something we give super close scrutiny to. This is an example where when it's something that changes how you call a thing, and the thing itself may be stabilized with that interface, then we may want to give that much more close scrutiny, even though it can only be used by the standard library. Because it effectively affects the perception of the language, because there is now permanently this mechanism of arguments that must be const when calling this standard library function, and that feels like a language surface area increase. So I think in general, that's something Lang should be consulted for.
Yes. I'm not sure. What is the in general? Well,
The
so I have
generalized version is if there's a Rust-C attribute that can only be used by the standard library, but it's being used in a standardized,
Right,
a stabilized function that we that affects how you call the function and not just the internals of the function, then we need to review that.
I have a suggestion here. I mean, one way to handle this would be to say that we just don't allow Rust-C attributes in this. Instead, it should have been written as a non-Rust-C attribute that needs a flag to get in. Like May Dangle was like that, right? The Lang team did review May Dangle. That was part of the drop check work, and it's in vector and other collection types. And it's still a sort of wart, but it's there, and it's only usable by the standard library effectively, unless people opt into nightly. And I think that forced us. My point only is that part of the issue here is that the use of Rust-C attribute meant that it's easy to miss.
Yeah, so Rust-C attributes in general should not be used for things that affect how a function is called. Is maybe the
I see.
Or like the API, so to speak.
So effectively,
instead unstable features should be.
Right, and then we review unstable features even if they're going to be permanently unstable.
That would be the idea.
Sounds reasonable. So it sounds like the next step is someone should unnominate this.
Yeah.
I'm happy to take an action item to leave a summary comment and unnominate for Lang anyway.
Yeah, it's too bad we have to adjust how nominations work, but I think you can go ahead. I think it's okay in this instance.
Yeah, I agree. There's to some degree, because we have cross-team items, we may want to have a like Lang nominated or Lib nominated or similar.
Yeah,
That
we've said
aside,
this,
though,
a million times. No one ever does it.
let's see if we can get one more item done in the next 2 minutes. I don't actually think we're going to be able to get through stabilize the pattern items in this meeting, because the thing that's
No.
blocked on is bike shedding the name of Pat 2015.
We won't, but I want to call attention to it for people. And I think I sort of liked my last proposal, so, but that's all I want to say. People look at it. If you think you care at all about this, take a look about what that thing is called.
But it does sound like the trend of the conversation is leaning towards drop the name 2015 entirely and just have a descriptive name that people can use, because people will want to use this in the future.
Yes.
And the question is just, what should that name be?
Yep.
Okay, we are officially out of time. So let's go ahead and wrap for the day, and any items that weren't covered, we can handle asynchronously or next week. Thanks, everybody.
Yep.
Thanks, Josh.